He lost his wife, his home, and his job. Everyone laughed when he bought an old bus for $200 and said he would build a home for children in it. But one encounter changed everything. An old man who reached out to him turned out to be the one who gave him hope again. See how a man without a roof over his head built a place where the light shone again. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The house no longer stood where it once had, but Michael still caught himself glancing toward the small hill at the end of the street, expecting to see its faded blue shutters and the crooked mailbox with his wife's handwriting on it. Now it was just a flat patch of earth, bare and quiet, with weeds curling through the dust. He could still remember the sound the front door made when Sarah opened it, how the hinges had complained softly, like an old man standing from a chair. That sound used to mean comfort, the end of a day's labor, the smell of soup, and the laughter of two small children somewhere inside. Now it was gone, swallowed by a silence too large for any one man to hold. He was 42, though he felt older. Years of work on construction sites had thickened his hands, marked his skin with pale scars and small burns from sawdust and sun. He had been a builder all his life. Houses, barns, porches, roofs that could hold through a storm. He knew how to make things stand, but he had never imagined how easily life could fall apart. Sarah's illness had begun quietly, just a cough that didn't go away, a shadow on a scan, the calm voice of a doctor that cracked the air open. The following months turned into a blur of hospital rooms, sleepless nights, and bills that stacked like bricks around him. He sold his truck first, then the tools he'd kept since apprenticeship, then the house. Each time he told Sarah it was just temporary, that she would get better, and they would buy everything back. She would smile, even when the pain made her eyes tremble, and say, "You always know how to build again." But she didn't get better. The money disappeared into treatments that promised little and delivered less. By the time she died, all that remained was a small box of her belongings, 2 children who didn't understand why the world had stopped, and a man who no longer knew what direction to walk. The funeral was small. The wind that morning was sharp and dry. The trees above the cemetery rattled with the sound of brittle leaves. A few neighbors came, 1 or 2 men from the job site who looked uncomfortable in their pressed shirts. Noah, 8 years old, stood motionless beside his father, his eyes too old for his face. Emma, only 5, clung to Michael's coat and whispered, "Is Mommy going to be a star now?" He couldn't answer. The words felt heavy, caught somewhere behind his chest. When the priest's voice faded and people drifted away, Michael stayed behind until the sky turned gray, staring at the fresh mound of dirt as if it could still give him something back. That night, he sat in the single-room basement they were renting. The ceiling was low, pipes running like veins above his head. He counted what little money he had, left a $37, and then stared at the sleeping shapes of his children. There was a strange kind of peace in their breathing, the only steady rhythm left in his life. The world outside had grown too wide, too loud, and too quick for a man who had lost everything. The next morning, a woman from social services came. Her hair was tied so tight it made her look younger, her tone clipped and careful. She carried a tablet and spoke in practiced sympathy. "Mr. Hayden," she said, "I understand it's been difficult, but the children need stability. You have 30 days to provide a safe and permanent residence, or we'll have to consider temporary placement." Temporary? The word hung like a blade. Michael nodded without looking up. When she left, he leaned against the door and whispered to himself, "They're not taking them." He tried. He took whatever work he could find, painting fences, carrying bricks, repairing old roofs for cash. He moved through the city like a ghost, a man between jobs, between homes, between breaths. Every night he came back to that damp room and watched the children draw pictures of a house that no longer existed. On one of those mornings, when the frost was still on the car windows and the sun was weak behind the clouds, he walked past a junkyard on the edge of town. That's when he saw it. An old yellow school bus, rusted along the seams, its windows fogged with years of neglect. Someone had scrawled a message on the windshield with a marker, $200. Not running. He stopped. The sight of it hit him in a strange way, like finding a piece of a dream left behind. He walked around it slowly, touching the cold metal. Beneath the rust, the bus still felt solid. He could almost imagine the sound of its doors opening, the laughter of children stepping in. He could imagine his own kids inside, sitting by the windows, sunlight spilling on their hair. An old man stepped out from behind a pile of scrap and eyed him suspiciously. "You looking to buy that thing?" Michael shrugged. "Thinking about it." "It don't move," the man said. "Engine's dead. Tires are flat. Floors half rotted." Michael looked through the window at the empty seats, the long, narrow aisle stretching to the driver's chair. "I don't need it to move," he said quietly. "I just need it to stand still." The man laughed, shaking his head. $200, cash. No refunds. Michael handed over the last bills he had. When he walked away, the man muttered, "People go crazy every winter." He spent the next day towing the bus with help from a friend's truck, dragging it to an open lot near the neighborhood where they used to live. It took half a day, the tires grinding against the gravel, the metal shrieking with every turn. But when it finally stopped, the children clapped. To them, it wasn't a wreck, it was a castle. That evening he swept the floor clean, tore out broken seats, and opened all the windows to let the cold air in. The smell of dust and metal filled the air. He told Noah and Emma, "This is where we'll start over." They giggled, pretending each window was a doorway. For the first time in weeks, Michael smiled. 2 days later, a neighbor called the police. The officer who arrived was polite but firm. "You can't live here," he said. "This is public property. You'll have to remove the vehicle." Michael tried to explain that it was temporary, that he was fixing it, that it wasn't hurting anyone. The officer only shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir. You've got 5 days." He left a notice taped to the door. That night, the bus felt colder than usual. The children slept wrapped in blankets, their breath visible in the dim light of a lantern. Michael sat by the door, listening to the wind scrape against the metal shell. He thought of Sarah again, how she used to keep a small garden by the porch, how she'd hum while cooking dinner. He reached into his pocket and pulled out her old photograph. She was standing in the sunlight, a hand raised to block the glare, smiling at him. He whispered, "I tried, Sarah. I really did." By morning, the notice on the door had turned damp from dew. He walked to the nearest houses, knocked on doors, and asked if he could park the bus in someone's yard, just for a while. Every answer was the same. "Sorry, we have kids. We don't want trouble with the town. It's against the regulations." One woman simply closed the door without speaking. That night, he packed their few belongings into a box, preparing to move again with nowhere to go. He thought of driving the bus until it stopped completely, somewhere beyond the reach of rules and eyes. As he sat on the step, head in his hands, a soft beam of light fell across the ground. Someone was approaching with a flashlight. An elderly man with silver hair and a worn coat stopped near the bus. His voice was calm, low, carrying the authority of someone who had seen too many winters. "You're the one everyone's talking about," he said. "The builder who lost his home." Michael didn't answer. The man studied him for a long moment. "You look like a man who knows how to work with his hands," he said finally. "But they won't let you, will they?" Michael lifted his eyes. They won't let me build anything anymore." The old man nodded slowly, then said, "Maybe you're just building in the wrong place." He extended a hand. "Name's Walter Green. I live out by the woods. Got some space behind my house, and an old workshop that could use company. Bring your bus there before they tow it. No one's going to bother you." Michael hesitated, unsure whether to trust a stranger, unsure whether hope was still a thing he could afford. The man's flashlight glowed faintly against the side of the bus, and in that light, for the first time in months, the world didn't look entirely hostile. Walter smiled slightly. "Come on, son. I've got coffee on the stove. Tomorrow, you'll tell me what needs fixing." Michael looked back at the sleeping shapes of his children, at the cracked windows of the bus, and then at the empty street behind the old man. He realized he had nothing left to lose, except them. He stood up, took a breath that tasted of rust and frost, and nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's go." And so, in the quiet dark before dawn, the man who had built homes for others, but lost his own, followed a stranger's light down an empty road, unaware that the patch of land waiting for him would one day hold more warmth than any house of brick or stone. The road that led to Walter Green's property wound through the outskirts of town, where asphalt gave way to gravel and the air smelled faintly of pine and wet earth. The old man's truck groaned with every turn, pulling the yellow bus slowly along behind it, like an exhausted animal being led to water. Michael sat in the passenger seat with his children huddled beside him, their faces pressed to the window. The headlights carved a thin path through the fog, and for the first time in many nights, the silence between them was not made of despair, but of something quieter. Expectation, maybe even the smallest fragment of hope. Walter didn't talk much, and neither did Michael. Occasionally, the old man would point out something half visible through the darkness, a collapsed barn, an overgrown orchard, the shadow of a deer crossing the road. "Used to be families here," he said once, "back when land meant something." When they finally reached his property, the first light of morning was beginning to rise. The place looked like a forgotten photograph. A small wooden house with peeling white paint, a porch sagging slightly on one side, a rusted pickup beside a collapsed shed, and acres of grass grown too long to walk through. Birds had built nests under the eaves, and vines crept up the sides of the house. Walter parked the truck and turned off the engine. "It's not much," he said, his breath clouding in the cold. "But no one will bother you here. The neighbors are too far away to care." Michael stepped out and looked around. The air smelled of dew and soil. For a long moment, he just stood there, feeling the strange stillness of a place untouched by the city's rules. The old man clapped a hand on his shoulder. "We'll park that bus behind the shed. Flat ground. Gets morning sun. You'll need that once winter comes." The bus rolled slowly into its new place, settling on the grass with a groan. It looked almost alive in the pale light, its windows catching the reflection of the trees. Noah and Emma ran around it laughing, their boots kicking up the wet grass. For a brief second, Michael felt something like peace. He hadn't seen his children smile like that since before the hospital days. He exhaled, the sound shaky but deep, and nodded to Walter. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You didn't have to do this." Walter waved a hand, brushing it off. "You're a builder, ain't you? I figure you just need a place to build again. I got tools, scrap wood, a few things lying around. Maybe we'll make something decent out of this heap." They spent the rest of the morning clearing space around the bus. Walter showed him an old shed filled with forgotten things, metal sheets, broken furniture, tools that had gathered dust but not lost their usefulness. "Half of this was meant for fixing tractors," he said with a grin. "Guess it'll do for a house, too." Michael worked until his hands burned. He tore out the remaining seats, scrubbed the floors, patched the holes in the ceiling. The children brought small pieces of wood and pretended to be helpers. Emma drew little hearts on the inside of the metal walls with chalk. Walter moved slower than him, his knees stiff, but his knowledge was precise. He showed Michael how to reinforce the frame, how to run wiring safely, how to seal the windows with resin so the cold wouldn't bite through. In the evenings, they sat by a fire pit Walter had built long ago. The old man drank coffee from a dented thermos. Michael sat with his children close, staring into the flames. The sound of crickets filled the darkness. Sometimes Walter spoke about his past snippets of stories, from his years as a mechanic, about his time in the army, about the son he used to have. The first time he mentioned the boy, his voice broke without warning. Name was Daniel, he said softly. Worked construction. Fell off a scaffold when he was 24. They said it was an accident. I never asked who forgot the harness. The fire cracked loudly, as if to fill the silence that followed. Michael didn't ask anything. He knew grief when he saw it. It had its own shape, its own language. Days turned into weeks. The bus slowly transformed. Michael replaced the flooring with wooden planks salvaged from a barn nearby. He built 2 small beds for the children from scraps of pine. Walter found an old stove, and together they fixed it, running a pipe through the roof for the smoke. By mid-December, the bus had light, warmth, and the faint smell of hope in the air. It wasn't much by anyone's standards, but it was theirs. Then came the first knock at the gate. 2 officers stood outside, their hands on their belts, expressions impassive. "Mr. Green," one of them called, "we've received complaints from your neighbors about unauthorized construction on your property." Walter chuckled dryly, leaning on his cane. "Neighbors, huh? The closest one's half a mile away. Guess they've got good binoculars." The officer didn't smile. "We'll need to see the structure." Michael stepped forward, tense. "It's just an old bus," he said. "We're not breaking any laws." The officer looked at the bus, at the smoke drifting gently from its pipe, then back at Walter. "We'll be in touch," he said. They left without another word, but Michael could feel the unease tightening in his chest. That night, he sat outside, watching the frost gather on the windows. "I don't want to cause you trouble," he told Walter. "If they fine you—" The old man interrupted, his tone sharp. "You let me worry about that. I've lived here 40 years. I've seen them come and go with their papers and warnings. None of them ever stayed long enough to understand what this land means." The next day, letters started to arrive. Official notices about zoning violations, temporary dwellings, and potential health hazards. Walter read them aloud with a kind of grim amusement, then tore them in half. "They talk like it's poison," he said, "but they never step inside to see how clean it is." For the children, life began to take on a rhythm. Noah started carving little wooden figures out of leftover blocks, lining them along the windowsill. Emma helped Michael paint the inside walls white, covering the rust with broad, uneven strokes. Every morning they woke to the sound of birds instead of sirens. In the evenings, they gathered around the small stove, the metal ticking as it cooled, and listened to Walter tell stories. There was one about the first car he ever repaired, another about the storm that nearly blew his house away in the 60s. Sometimes he'd trail off mid-sentence, lost in memory. Michael would wait quietly, never pushing him to continue. As Christmas approached, Michael built a small shelf above the doorway and placed Sarah's photograph there. Emma decorated it with pine cones and ribbons she found in Walter's attic. "Now Mommy can see our new house," she said. Michael had to step outside for air after that. He stood in the cold until his breath came steady again. One evening, Walter brought out an old metal stove from his shed, a heavier, sturdier one, and told Michael they'd install it properly. Together, they spent hours fitting the chimney, cutting through metal, sealing joints. When the first fire burned inside it, the bus filled with a soft golden light. Walter nodded approvingly. "You've built something real here," he said. "Not just walls. Something people can feel." Michael didn't answer, but he felt the truth of it settle deep inside. Winter deepened. Snow fell thick across the fields, covering the bus roof in white. The children pressed their faces to the windows to watch it, giggling when flakes melted against the glass. The heat from the stove made the air shimmer faintly. Outside, Walter's breath rose like smoke as he trudged through the snow, carrying a bucket of nails or a piece of wood. Sometimes Michael caught himself watching the old man, the slow determination of his movements, the way he refused to be beaten by age or weather. One night, when the wind howled and the fire burned low, Walter sat beside him, staring into the embers. "You know," he said quietly, "people think charity's about giving money or pity. It's not. It's about letting someone stay long enough to find their footing again. That's all I'm doing here." Michael looked at him and replied, "That's more than anyone's done for me in a long time." The days became indistinguishable, marked only by the rhythm of work and the growing sense that maybe, just maybe, they could make it through the winter. The town officials came once more, this time with a clipboard and photographs. Walter met them at the gate again. "He's not breaking the law," he said firmly. "He's fixing what's broken." The officials left with nothing but frost on their shoes and silence behind them. By the start of February, the bus no longer looked like a relic. Inside, it felt alive. There were shelves built from old planks, curtains sewn from discarded fabric, a table Walter had helped repair. The floor gleamed faintly in the firelight, and the smell of pine resin mixed with warmth from the stove. Outside, the snow melted in slow rivulets under the sun. One evening, as the fire crackled, Michael leaned back against the wall, his children asleep beside him. Walter was in his chair near the door, his eyes half closed. The old man murmured, "You did it, son. You built a home again." Michael shook his head. "No, we built it." Walter smiled faintly. "Maybe. But you gave it a heartbeat." The wind eased outside, the night falling into calm. Michael stared at the photograph of Sarah above the doorway, the flames reflecting softly against the glass. He thought of the hospital, the house that was gone, the people who had turned him away, and then he looked around this narrow, glowing space. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't safe in any legal sense, but it was more of a home than he had dared to hope for. He whispered, almost to himself, "We're still standing, Sarah." And outside, beyond the frost-covered windows, the first hint of dawn began to rise, painting the sky in pale silver light over the bus that no one believed could be a home on the land of a man who had lost everything but kindness. By the time spring came, the field behind Walter Green's house had turned from a flat sheet of white into a deep carpet of green. The snow melted slowly, revealing the outlines of footprints and the stubborn trails the tires of the bus had left in the earth. The air was different now, warmer, more forgiving, and with it came a quiet sense of beginning that Michael hadn't felt since before Sarah died. The bus gleamed in the sunlight, freshly painted a soft cream color that Emma had chosen herself. The word home, written in crooked, childish letters, stretched across the back door. Walter had laughed when he saw it, shaking his head, but there had been pride in his eyes. Inside, the world was small but complete. The wooden floor gleamed, smooth beneath their feet. The stove hummed softly, and above it hung a small pot where soup simmered. On the shelf above the door rested Sarah's photograph, surrounded by wildflowers Noah and Emma collected each morning. The two children slept in their bunk beds at night, whispering secrets to each other until their voices blended with the chirping of crickets outside. Every morning they woke to light pouring through the windows, to the smell of coffee, and the sound of Walter's slow steps on the porch. Michael had found odd jobs in town, repairing fences, fixing porches, rebuilding what others had left to rot. Word had spread quickly that he could make anything with his hands. He saved every dollar carefully, buying wood, nails, and a new set of tools. For the first time in a long time, his back ached, not from worry, but from honest work. When he came home each evening, his children would run down the path to meet him, their laughter carrying across the field. He could see Walter watching from the porch, a cup of tea in hand, the faintest smile curving his lips. The bus had become something more than a shelter. It was a symbol, even to the neighbors who had once complained. People came to see it now, curious at first, then admiring. One brought a can of paint, another an old armchair, another a bag of curtains. The thing that had once been called an eyesore now stood as a quiet testament to what could be built from loss. Walter joked that he'd started a movement without meaning to. "They'll be building buses all over the county soon," he said one morning, adjusting the brim of his cap. Michael smiled, but didn't answer. He knew this place wasn't about imitation. It was about survival, about gratitude, about the rare meeting of two broken lives that somehow managed to mend together. Then, one afternoon, the same white car returned up the dirt road. The engine cut through the stillness, its tires grinding against gravel. Michael's stomach sank. He recognized it instantly, the seal of the county social services on the side. He wiped his hands on his jeans and met the woman who stepped out. She wasn't the same inspector who had come months ago. This one was younger, with soft brown eyes that looked more curious than judgmental. "Mr. Hayden," she said, glancing at her clipboard. "We're following up on your previous case. I need to conduct a final evaluation regarding the welfare of your children." He felt the old fear rise in him, a reflex that no amount of sunlight could erase. Walter stepped beside him, his posture straight despite his age. "They're fine here," he said firmly. "You don't need to look at papers to see that." The woman smiled politely. "I just need to verify the conditions." She stepped inside the bus, her shoes tapping gently on the wooden floor. Her gaze moved over the small table, the clean dishes stacked neatly, the bunk beds, the sunlight on the wall. She ran a hand along the windowsill, inspecting the seal, then turned to the photograph above the door. "Is this your wife?" she asked quietly. Michael nodded. "She passed 2 years ago." The inspector's face softened. She looked around once more, then crouched beside the children, who had been watching from the doorway. "Do you like living here?" she asked. Emma nodded eagerly. "Daddy built this house. Walter helped. We have lights and a stove, and Mommy's picture gets the best sunlight in the morning." The inspector stood, meeting Michael's eyes. "You've done a good job here," she said simply. "It's safe, it's clean. I'll close the case." For a moment, the words didn't seem real. He waited for her to add a condition, a warning, a request for signatures. But she only smiled again, shook his hand, and left the bus. The white car rolled away, leaving nothing but dust and the faint echo of relief in its wake. Walter clapped him on the shoulder, laughing quietly. "Well, look at that," he said. "You beat the system with a wrench and some plywood." That evening, Michael sat outside, his children chasing fireflies near the fence. Walter brought out 2 mugs of coffee and sat beside him. The air smelled of pine and fresh-cut grass. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The horizon glowed faintly pink, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the field. Finally, Walter said, "You know, I didn't bring you here because I wanted to help someone. I brought you here because I needed noise in this place again. I'd forgotten what laughter sounded like." Michael turned toward him. You gave us more than a place to stay. You gave us a life again." The old man shook his head. "No, you built that yourself. I just handed you the hammer." The days grew warmer, the grass higher. The bus became a kind of living thing, flowers planted in boxes beneath the windows, a wooden porch built by Michael's hands. Sometimes children from the nearby houses came to visit, bringing scraps of bread to feed Walter's chickens. Noah built a swing from a piece of rope and an old plank, hanging it from a sturdy oak. Emma painted the steps bright yellow. In the evenings, music drifted from the radio, an old tune that Walter loved. It was a life stitched together from fragments, imperfect, but strong. Then came the morning when the porch felt empty. The air inside the house was still, too still. Michael found Walter sitting in his chair by the window, the sunlight warming his face, his eyes closed. The half-empty mug of tea sat beside him, the steam long gone. Michael stood there for a long moment, before realizing the silence wasn't sleep. The old man was gone. The funeral was small, much like Sarah's had been, but this time there was no emptiness. People came, neighbors, workers from town, even the same officer who had once told him to leave. They brought flowers and stories. Michael buried Walter beneath the large oak near the bus, the one where Noah's swing now swayed gently in the wind. On the wooden cross he carved with his own hands, he wrote, "Walter Green, the man who let hope stay." That night, as the sun sank behind the trees, Michael sat on the steps of the bus. The light from inside spilled onto the grass, golden and warm. His children were asleep inside, their faces peaceful in the glow of the lantern. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "Thank you, old man, for everything." Months passed. The seasons turned again. By summer, Michael's small construction business had grown. People who had once avoided him now called for his help. He repaired roofs, built porches, and quietly set aside a portion of every payment. When enough money gathered, he bought another broken bus, then another. He repaired them the way he had repaired his own scrubbing away rust, fitting them with floors, windows, and warmth. One by one, they became homes for families who had nowhere else to go. He called the project the Green Foundation, in memory of the man who had given him ground to stand on. Each bus had a small plaque near the door that read, "Built on Hope." Some were painted bright colors, others left simple, but all carried the same light that had once burned in the field behind Walter's house. Years later, when visitors came to see the original bus, they would find it surrounded by a garden of wildflowers, with a wooden sign standing near the entrance. On it, carved deep into the grain, were the words, "Home of Walter," the place where light returned. Inside, Michael still kept Sarah's photograph above the door, and beside it, one of Walter, smiling faintly, a hand on the shoulder of the man he had once helped. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Michael would sit outside as he had done years ago, listening to the hum of crickets and the soft breathing of his children sleeping within. He'd look at the stars and think of all that had come from one act of kindness, one broken man giving another a chance. He'd think of Sarah and of Walter and of the life that had grown between their ghosts. Emma, now older, would sometimes join him on those nights. She'd lean against him and ask, "Dad, do you think Walter can see the light from our window?" Michael would smile, his eyes on the horizon. "I think he sees all of them," he'd say. "Every bus, every home, every bit of light that came after." The night would stretch around them, soft and alive, and the wind would whisper through the trees. The old bus, once a symbol of desperation, now stood as something sacred proof that even in the ruins of loss, a man could build again, not just with nails and wood, but with faith, with gratitude, and with love. And so the light stayed, flickering gently through the windows, spilling into the dark field like a promise that home is not a place you are given, but something you make and protect, and that once you build it with your own hands, it can never truly be taken away. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us for the next one. Watch the other stories on the channel. Each one has a truth worth hearing. And if you believe someone needs to see this, share it.